All right, welcome to The Explainer. I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine that on one specific future day, every single grave on planet Earth is going to crack open. That's the wild vision we're unpacking today from what might be one of the most intense sermons ever preached. We are diving deep into the work of an 18th century theologian named Thomas Boston to really understand his dramatic and frankly terrifying guide to the final resurrection. Everything starts right here. Boston builds his entire, absolutely electrifying argument on this one single verse from the Gospel of John. And you've got to understand, for him, this wasn't some kind of metaphor. No, it was a literal promise. A promise that sets the stage for a massive cosmic event involving every single person who has ever lived. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're breaking his sermon down into 6 key parts. We'll follow his logic step by step, from the main idea itself all the way to its dramatic and very different consequences for all of humanity. Okay, first up, Boston establishes what he calls the core doctrine. He wants to be crystal clear from the get-go. The resurrection isn't just a nice story, and it is definitely not some exclusive event for a chosen few. Nope, it's for everyone. So let's be super clear about what he's saying. Boston is arguing for a literal, physical, and completely universal event. It doesn't matter if a body was buried, lost at sea, or even turned to ash. He believed that at one specific moment, a single voice will call out, and every last particle of every single body will be perfectly put back together. Now, you're probably thinking, whoa, that is a staggering claim. I mean, how could anyone be certain of something so miraculous? Well, Boston saw that skepticism coming from a mile away, and he built his entire case for why this is certain on 2 main pillars of logic. His logic is actually pretty straightforward. First, he argues that an all-powerful God, the one who created everything, certainly has the capability to raise the dead. And second, he argues that through Scripture, God has made a promise, which means he has the will to do it. So for Boston, it's a matter of both divine power and divine integrity. God can do it, and he will do it. To explain God's power, he uses this fantastic analogy that his 18th century audience would have totally gotten. He asks, look, if a human watchmaker can take a jumbled mess of tiny, complex gears and put them back together into a working watch, why on earth would we doubt that the creator of the entire universe can reassemble a human body? Then he tackles the next logical problem, knowledge. How could God possibly keep track of all those particles? He uses another great analogy, comparing God to an apothecary, like an old-school pharmacist who knows every single herb and ingredient in his shop. In the same way, he argues, an all-knowing God can teleport every particle of dust that ever belonged to a specific person, no matter how scattered it's become over thousands of years. But power and knowledge, they still aren't enough. For Boston, the ultimate certainty comes from the promise. He argues that God has basically bound himself to this act through a secret covenant. So the resurrection isn't just possible, it's an inevitability. It's something that has to happen to fulfill God's own word. Okay, so he's laid the groundwork. He's argued why it's certain. Now he gets to the really dramatic part. What does this day actually look like? He doesn't just argue that it will happen. He paints this incredibly vivid, step-by-step picture of how it's all going to go down. He describes this as a moment of just absolute cosmic drama. A trumpet blast echoes across the entire globe, reaching the deepest parts of the ocean and the highest mountains. It's like a universal alarm clock, and for this one, there is no hitting the snooze button. Every soul is reunited with its newly reformed body to face whatever comes next. And this is where Boston's sermon reaches its emotional and honestly, its terrifying peak. Because while the event itself is universal, it happens to everybody, the experience of it is profoundly different for 2 distinct groups of people. And the divide just could not be more stark. He describes the righteous rising up from their graves with this overwhelming joy, almost like a bride emerging on her wedding day. But in horrifying contrast, the wicked don't rise at all. They are dragged forth from the earth in absolute terror, like a criminal being pulled from a dungeon to face their execution. To make this feeling totally real, Boston actually puts words in their mouths. He imagines this joyful dialogue between the righteous soul and its body. A beautiful reunion, a celebration of how they were faithful in life, and the glorious future that's waiting for them, where every part of the body will finally be used for eternal praise. And then you get the flip side. It is brutal. The wicked soul and body, they reunite only to curse each other. They become each other's worst enemy, trapped in this eternal argument over who's to blame for their horrible fate. The body screams at the soul for leading it down a path of destruction, a path they'll now pay for, together, forever. So what happens after they come out of the ground? Well, next, Boston gets into the nitty-gritty of the permanent state of these resurrected bodies. See, they aren't just reanimated. They are completely transformed into their final, eternal forms. And once again, you see this total split. It is just night and day. The body of the righteous is perfected. It's made incorruptible. It can't feel pain, and it's so glorious it's said to shine like the sun. But the wicked body, it's also made eternal, but for a totally horrifying reason. It's perfected only in its ability to endure everlasting shame, contempt, and torment. So after all this theology and all this dramatic, terrifying imagery, you have to ask, what was the point of all this? Why was this teaching so critical for Boston and his congregation? Well, he wraps it all up with two intensely practical applications, one of comfort and one of pure terror. And this really reveals the whole dual purpose of the doctrine. For the believers listening, it was meant to be the ultimate source of comfort. It promised that death wasn't the end, that they'd be reunited with loved ones in these perfect new bodies. But for everyone else, it was the ultimate warning, a terrifying vision of a day of judgment you absolutely could not escape. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. For Boston's audience, this wasn't some abstract myth. It was a framework for ultimate justice, a belief that every single action in this life had an eternal physical consequence. It really forces us to ask, how does your entire worldview change when you truly believe in a final, literal, bodily accounting for everything you've ever done?